Welcome to our presentation today. My name is Rob Davies. I'm a Global Product Manager at Miser Filtration Products out in Camarillo, California. We're all very excited to talk to you today about something that is very innovative. Single-use, end-to-end platform solution. Now, there's a little bit more detail to it in the subtitle here. Single-use freeze-thaw platform capable of providing an end-to-end solution for bulk drug substance, interfacility storage, and delivery. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty hefty subtitle. There's a lot in there. So how about we unpack that just a little bit? So there's going to be three main presentation objectives today. The first, we're going to review the improvements in the design of the containers themselves, the single-use containers for the application of freeze-thaw. So that's the starting point. That's going to be a lot of the focal point of our discussion today. The next thing that we're going to go into is really go into the mechanics of freezing. It's not just enough to come up with an improvement to a container, but there needs to be an improvement considering the design features of that container to improve the way BDS is frozen and thawed. And of course, lastly, because we did have platform, end-to-end platform in the title, we're going to tie things together, provide you with an understanding of the value of an end-to-end platform solution for freeze-thaw application for BDS. So today's presentation, we've broken up into four main parts. So if we're going to be talking about a solution, we have to describe a little bit about the problem. So the first thing that we'll go into is the current state. What's out there right now? What are we using for the freeze and thaw application for BDS? What are maybe some of the issues that are plaguing the industry in that regard? The next part of the presentation will be the design features of the container itself. Now here, this is where we're going to go into the anatomy of the actual container that is the focus of today's discussion. And of course, as I had just mentioned before, it's not just enough to be able to improve the design of the container itself, but we have to understand what the mechanics of freezing are going to be like. What is it that we're changing to the way that might be different perhaps from the way that you're doing it already about how you're freezing and thawing bulk drug substance? And then at the very end, we're going to tie it all together and provide you with a holistic sense of what that end-to-end process solution should look like. So considering the container, considering some of the equipment, some of the mechanics involved with the freeze and thaw, we'll tie everything together and provide you with a summary of what that platform will look like. So to kick us off, let's start with something very familiar to all of us, cryovessels. Cryovessels, whether they're made out of stainless steel, maybe they're made out of halloysite, they're a mainstay within this part of the operations. It's the gold standard for a reason. The materials construction are very robust. It's very familiar. Operations are often facilities are designed around the use of these cryovessels. But one thing, even as great as cryovessels are, one of the things you can't really quite get away from is the expense. There's a lot of money that you have to spend in order to maintain these types of containers. So you have to be able to have expensive utilities, clean in place, steam in place. That's very expensive. We're talking about specialized training. Even if you train your own folks, or even if you don't train your own folks and you have to outsource this service, that's an added expense. That's an added logistic that is going to hamper you down. And of course, it's very capital intensive. These things aren't cheap. It's not cheap to support. So there's a lot of money being used to support the cryovessels. Now that's one end of the spectrum, right? So if we consider the other end of the spectrum, the single-use solutions that are out there, the single-use bags specifically. One of the great thing about the single-use bags is that it has a low footprint. They're easy to handle. Maybe they're perhaps relatively inexpensive. But one of the things you can't get away from is the fragility that happens under the frozen conditions. So when you freeze the bags, the material, the EVOA, for example, will become brittle, and you get little cracks, you get little tears, and then when you thaw it, you get leaks, and you have lost product. That right there is very expensive. I mean, we're not talking about the expense of maintaining the container. Now we're talking about the expense of lost product. So that's something that's definitely an issue. Of course, because they are bags, there's going to be a limitation to how much volume you can actually put into them. Because the volume and the weight there's going to be a limitation as to how much you can hold into a single bag at a single time. Right now, I think the estimate around is just under 20 liters would be the max volume of a single-use bag right here on the market. Another notable limitation is the shape. So when you fill these bags up, they can take on a certain shape, but if the fill volume differs, the shape will also differ. That's going to cause some variability in your freeze-thaw performance. I would keep a mental note of that aspect, because we're going to tie that back in later into the presentation. Another aspect that's not necessarily container specific or product specific is process integration itself. So at the very end of this presentation, we're going to come back to this note here, and that is some of the issues that may arise from having to procure individual pieces of equipment dedicated for you to complete each step within that freeze-thaw process. We're not just talking about freeze and thaw, we're talking about fill and dispense and shipping and distribution. All of those need to work in concert with each other, and ideally you'd want that to be pre-qualified to ensure the endpoint, that endpoint being ensuring the quality of your BDS after thaw. One of the other limitations that you may have in terms of process integration is the complexity that may arise. Because you're procuring this equipment one at a time, and you're figuring out how to use the equipment to complete each step, whether it's freeze or thaw or fill or dispense, you may be creating some process complexity. And as some of us already understand, when it comes to complexity, we're introducing risk because of that complexity. So what we ought to see is a process that reduces that risk by reducing that complexity, something that's been pre-qualified to be able to work with the containers. So this is not really anything to do with any equipment or any containers or anything about processes. This is just really an overview of the way freeze and thaw actually happens, some of the mechanics of the freezing and thawing process itself. What we see here in this image over to the right is a cryo wedge. That's your classic cryo vessel cryo wedge. What we're trying to illustrate here are two different things. One, ice bridging. Now, we'll go into ice bridging a lot more in detail later, but what we're seeing here with that, if we see that bright magenta center, that's as a result of ice bridging, because what ice bridging really means is that you have a basically frozen material surrounding the liquid material within that body. Cryo concentration, we'll also go into a little bit later, is something that will adversely affect your protein quality, degradation, aggregation, and so forth. The notable thing to take away from here is the bulging and the pressure buildup that occurs because of that ice bridging. Now, if we remember a lot of some of the limitations with the single-use systems, or even just fragile containers, if you're using glass carboys, for example, for your freeze and thaw of your drug substance, that's what's causing the container to lose its integrity. It's the bulging, it's the pressure buildup, and the subsequent failure of that container. So that rounds out some of the issues within the current state of the industry. Just a very high-level overview. Cryo vessels, single-use bags, the freezing process is generally understood now today, primarily with the use of cryo vessels, as well as some of the issues around process integration. Now we're going to get into something very exciting, and that's where I'm going to walk you through this container and all the design features and benefits that come along with it. So we had a problem, and we needed to seek a solution. So the innovation arose from user requirements based off a lot of those issues I just described. So what we're going into for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to really break it up into two big buckets. The consumable, which is probably one of the more exciting parts, because we have it right here, I can demo it for you. The consumable, because of those limitations, which I won't repeat right now, needs to be robust. It needs to be scalable, so we need large volume support. It needs to be single use, so we are not having to have a lot of expense for maintaining the container. And it needs to be operationally flexible. This is an innovative new product. It needs to be able to integrate into current processes, as well as be able to adapt to a lot of different operational paradigms across all different enterprises within the industry. And then, because it is ultimately about a platform, we're going into more detail around platform utility. That needs to be obviously freeze and thaw. Those are some basics. It needs to include shipping and distribution. You have your drug substance site and you have your drug product site, and they're going to be in different locations, often across different parts of the globe. So you need to be able to have that support to ensure the safety and security of your BDS. And lastly, but not least, again, needs to be scalable. The platform itself needs to be able to support each scale individually, as well as provide some cross-compatibility between those platforms. So just to give you, before I go into the hands-on demo, wanted to provide you with a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. One of the most notable features of the container design is its robustness. In so many words, this thing can really take a beating. We've done impact testing, pressure testing, drop testing at frozen conditions and ambient conditions. It's very robust. And one of the most notable things that I haven't really touched upon yet that I'm going to stress now, large volume support. So this is not an example of large volume. This is a relatively small volume platform size here. But if you go to the booth, you'll be able to see a 75-liter container that holds that much fluid in one container. And that's a sharp contrast to the multiple different bags that you may have to use in order to be able to complete that volume set. So we'll go into some features that really lend itself well to being able to handle large volumes. As I briefly mentioned before, operational flexibility, that's going to come in terms of scalable freeze-thaw performance. So no matter what container you use, whether it's the small container or the large container, you need to have identical freeze-thaw performance. You need to be able to scale up from, perhaps if you're starting out with a clinical production and want to go up to full-blown, large batch commercial production, you want to be able to ensure that your bulk drug substance is going to be of the same quality no matter which platform you use. The scalable operations, that's really going to the platform support. So you're not having to shoehorn in a container size into a different platform with that own equipment. So you should be able to have dedicated support for each platform. One thing that's great about one aspect about the operational flexibility, and that's the custom configuration for the tubing. We'll go into that more in a moment. And last but definitely not least, because this whole thing is really revolving around single use, needs to be single use, and that's going to lend itself to some cost effectiveness. If we compare it to the cryo vessels, if you compare it to the maintenance and the cost and logistics and training that it costs to be able to maintain those cryo vessels, it can be considered more cost effective. Now, if we also compare it to single use bags, compare it to the occasional or perhaps potential of lost bulk drug substance as a result of compromised containers, there is some cost effectiveness there because that won't happen with this rigid container. And of course, it can be single use all day, but if it's not going to interact with your bulk drug substance well, it's not going to do much value. Because of the material construction, it's a rigid, high density polyethylene medical grade resin. It has a low extractables and leachables profile. And last, some of the things that we try to do as when supporting a single-use product is environmental sustainability. Those from across the pond out in Europe, this is something that's really big that's come to the forefront. It is recyclable. All right, so this is where the fun begins. So we'll start from the top, which means we're going to start with the TalkWorks. What the TalkWorks is a customized configuration of platinum silicone and TPE. The configuration can be adapted to make sure that you have backup lines in case you have some sort of compromise to one of the lines, you lose sterility, you want to close that off, you have other lines to be able to do the fill and dispense a function. The great thing about the TalkWorks, of course, is that it comes with a lot of different features. I won't go into the details around some of the configurations, but just understand that this is something that is pretty customizable. So a lot has been stressed around the container and its structural container, namely its robustness. And there's a lot of different things that really lend itself to being able to support that robustness. You can kind of see it in that picture because I have it outlined in a black dashed line. But if you kind of come up close and you kind of see here, you'll see a series of ridges that kind of network around the surface of that container, right? What is that? That is a network of ribbing that actually helps to support against pressure buildup that may occur during the freeze process. So that's actually lending itself to added support in addition to the fact that it's made out of HDPE. Now, there's holes in this thing, right? Why are there holes? Well, one of the things one of the analogies that I like to use is if you're pulling out a case of, I remember back in the day, I think Costco had, 2 packs of milk in a cardboard box, or, you're pulling a case of beer out of the fridge and you're taking it by the handle, and, you take it by the handle and you're going to pull it off the shelf, and what happens to that handle? It tears right through. Like, why do they put a handle? Well, it's the container is not going to be very good to you if you can't handle it very well. So what these holes are actual counterbores. These counterbores are reinforced HDPE so that you can actually interact material handling equipment with this container. And this is something that is going to be very critical to when you start handling large, heavy volume containers, and notably that size, the 75-liter container. So we have added support for the material handling process. One of the things you're not going to be able to see, obviously, by demonstration is the way that it is made. Rotational molding. Rotational molding is a very clean process. It's a very high-quality process to ensure that you have even distribution or even wall thickness across the container itself. With this container, with the 75-liter container, the wall thickness is nearly a 1/4 inch thick. So the first thing I did when I started this demo was I took off this cover. This is what we internally like to call the shroud. This shroud, as you can probably tell, its primary function is to protect the tubing. That's really critical when you start looking, or you start using materials under frozen conditions. Like all things do, they become a little bit more brittle under those cold temperatures, so you need that protection. Now, this is something that's going to be very critical coming into the mechanics of freezing when we start talking about the actual freezing process is the headspace insulation. So what we've done is we've added a little bit more plastic to the top compared to the rest of the container body. That's going to perform some insulation when we start talking about heat exchange and controlled rate freezing. As it relates also to the holes that we have in these containers, that you can actually have tamper evidence. You can loop a cable around this container and keep that lid in place for tamper evidence. So fill and dispense. So one of the great things that you can't see, unfortunately, but I do have a cutout, is the dip tube. So in the corners of all the containers, both sides, if you were to cut that out, you would see a dip tube. Now, why is that important? Why is that such a critical function? Well, if you've ever tried pouring a glass of beer from the tap, and you pour it straight down, what's going to happen? Half that glass is going to be foam at least, right? So if you're trying to reduce foaming, you want to fill at an angle. This dip tube, what it effectively does with the help of gravity, is that it forces the fluid to flow along the edge of the wall of the container. That's going to reduce the foaming. And an added benefit from also what comes in dispense is that it actually reduces that hold-up volume. You're actually able to get more out of that container because you have that dip tube extending all the way down to the edge of that well, and if you were to do this at an angle, which is what is recommended to fill and dispense at an angle, that little bit of cooling that you get, you're able to get more of that out, reducing that hold-up volume ultimately. So one of the things that this same image we're going to be tying back at the end of the presentation, but one thing to note between the two different size containers, I've made a lot of reference to scalability and scales and platform. The two sizes of the containers, a 20-liter and a 100-liter container, share a lot of the same identical features and functions. They have topworks, ribbing, counterbores, HDPE, rotational molding. But one thing that is going to be critical when we start talking about the function of freezing is the container width. Regardless of whether you're using a 20-liter or 100-liter container, that container width is identical. That may not sound like very exciting right now, but it will be later on in the presentation. So We talked a lot about the container itself, and in and of itself, it is very innovative. It's a very innovative technology. A lot of development's been done on it, a lot of work, a lot of rational design. But it's not just enough to be able to come up with a solution for the containers themselves. What you need to be able to also provide is an improvement in the way that the freeze and thaw functions. So in this part of the presentation, we're going to explain a little bit about how that works. So in the image here, so there's a lot of different ways to freeze and thaw anything. One of the easiest ways is you just fill the container, put it into a set point freezer or Revco. That's set at -80, and you just let it go. You come back the next day, it's frozen. Some solutions out there employ plate freezing. There's a lot of different ways. But so here, what we're going to try to provide you with an understanding with is what type of freeze-thaw method is optimal for ensuring BDS quality with the use of this innovative design container. Before we go into that, just want to briefly recap on a basic concept that affects the quality of BDS, and that is cryoconcentration. So when we have slow freezing, meaning that that's when you sort of just put that container into the freezer at a set point and just let it go. What happens is that you have an accumulation of solute in the liquid phase. So as the edge of the container, the liquid surface interface freezes, you have that solute migrating into the liquid phase. If you've ever heard of the process called Applejack, where you take an alcoholic beverage and try to enhance its alcohol content, this is basically what it is. You freeze out the water or the aqueous layer, you remove the ethanol, and you're able to create a more concentrated or higher concentrated beverage. The bad thing about this, as it relates to BDS, is that when you have cryoconcentration, there's alterations to the pH, to the salinity, and obviously the temperature. All of that is really going to mess with the protein integrity. You're going to be getting degradation, aggregation of antibodies, and so forth. So this diagram here is showing you the process by which we are freezing these containers, and that is through a air blast cooling, convection air cooling. So we're using very cold air, blasting it across the sides of the container itself. Now, one of the notable things about the actual shape, other than that it's a square, why isn't it circle? Why isn't it another shape? This is because it maximizes the surface area to volume ratio. So we just mentioned the fact that when you have quote unquote slow freezing, and that's creating concentration, if you have a greater surface area to volume ratio, what that's going to do is that's going to speed up the heat exchange. You're going to get a faster rate of cooling as a result of that design. An added benefit of when it comes to process integration is the fact that when you have these containers in a palletized load, because we're not just freezing just one at a time, we're freezing several of these containers in a cycle within a single load. So the airflow lends itself well to being able to pass in between the spaces in the container, as well as on the outside of the container, enhancing or increasing the rate of freezing. Another way to show that, the computational fluid dynamics image here shows in a palletized load how that airflow will flow between the containers in a pallet, as well as on the outside and over. So ice bridging, that was something that we talked about a little bit before. This is a very daunting, very intimidating slide with a lot of math. I don't know how many mathematicians are out there. I'm not very good at math, so I'm going to try to explain this a little bit more conceptually for you. What this image is showing is the difference in freezing rate between the body of the fluid in the container versus the rate of freezing that occurs at the liquid and air interface. In order for ice bridging to be avoided, you need to have part of this fluid not freezing at the same rate as the other parts of the fluid are freezing. So what you're showing here in these arrows that are on the pink, sort of in that pink shaded area, that's where you have a higher rate of freezing. So you're going to be having the freezing happening from the bottom up and the outside in, leaving the very last part of freezing at that air-liquid interface. Now, we remembered a little bit about that shroud, right? The somewhat innocuous shroud that just protects the tubing. Well, that's where that headspace insulation part comes in, if you remember. That headspace insulation, as a result of the shroud or the added layer of HDPE, is what's going to slow that rate of heat exchange relative to the rest of the liquid body. Therefore, what you have is a last point to freeze. That last point of freeze is going to be at the liquid-air interface at the meniscus of the fluid. Another way to demonstrate where that last point of freeze is, we have controlled and uncontrolled rate freezing. So if we take just let's take the bottom row, for example, okay? So at 12 hours, we see that there's a little bit still left unfrozen. That's the uncontrolled last point to freeze. And we see that relative to its position in that square, it's not at the top. It's a little bit more towards the middle. What that's indicating is a bit of ice bridging that's occurring. So what you have is you have a frozen material sort of surrounding that piece of liquid, that piece that's still unfrozen. What you're likely going to get from that as a result is a little bit of pressure buildup because of the ice bridging, and you may be risking container integrity issues. Now, let's contrast that with the 14-hour mark on the controlled performance run at the top. So as I was explaining before, what you want in a controlled freeze run with the use of this container is a last point to freeze that's at the top, and that is exactly what we see here. The last piece that is left unfrozen is right at that fluid meniscus at the center of that square. That is something that is by avoiding that ice bridging, we've actually protected an already rigid container from any risk of pressure buildup that might affect container integrity. Another way to demonstrate the freeze performance, comparing it to 2 to 8 hours, we see the path at which the freezing happens. It happens from the bottom up, and it happens from the outside in. I almost liken this to one of the things I was thinking about to try to, to create an analogy is almost like a tube of toothpaste, where you want to be able to roll that tube of toothpaste from the bottom, and so that the very last piece of toothpaste is actually at the top of that tube. So here is we're going to be seeing something very similar to where that, because of that controlled rate freezing, our last point to freeze is going to be at the very top of at the fluid, at the liquid air interface. So this is somewhat representative of the broad side of the container on the left. And then if we took a width cutout of the container, the last point of freeze would be somewhere around over here. So remember this image from before, right? I talked about identical length, or identical width rather, of the containers and why that's important. No matter what container you use, whether it's a 20 liter or the 100 liter, you're going to have the same width in addition to all the other great design features within the container. What that is that that's providing a consistent freeze path length. So no matter how much volume, whether you're at max volume, min volume, using the 20 liter size or the 100 liter size, you're going to get a consistent freeze path length. And that is because of the rigid container itself. When we don't have a bag, when we don't have a container that's meant to change its shape, that's how you're able to get that consistency. So we spoke a lot and reviewed a lot about the issues, proposed design features that address some of those issues within the container itself. We talked a little bit about how potentially changing the way BDS is frozen and thawed may improve or help to improve BDS quality by avoiding ice bridging and cryo concentration. We're going to tie everything together now and really address the actual end-to-end process itself. Some of the key features that are ideal for an end-to-end platform solution for single-use bulk drug substance freeze-thaw is the custom integration with the container. So as any platform, as any process, you have a focal point. That focal point here is the container. And ideally what you'd like in order to avoid any process complexity or any risk of unqualified or non-qualified equipment is custom integration with the container, where you have a lot of equipment already designed to be able to interface with the container, namely some of these reinforced counterbores. The process steps transition support is also notable because, as I mentioned before, it's not just enough to be able to complete each process individually. You have to be able to support the transition from fill to dispense, those being the ends of the process. In our day and age, most everything is global. You need to have a platform that's going to be able to support specifically that size container, as well as lend itself to support potentially other sizes as well. Here is an example of a freezer holding our 300-liter capacity. So we have four large containers, each filled at 75 liters. Altogether, that's 300 liters of bulk drug substance you can freeze and thaw in one single cycle using a single-use container. And here's an example of the small size or the small scale. It's a slightly different configuration, but it's already been qualified. What we see here is a 20-liter container. So this container here that we have on the table, 6 of those fit into the freezer. 96 liters total can be frozen and thawed within a single cycle. So when we talk about the process, just to ensure that we're all envisioning the same process in our mind's eye, here's what we're talking about. So when we really refer to the process and when we refer to the end-to-end, the ends that we're referring to is the fill and dispense. The fill and dispense are your ends, and equipment and a whole host of other different pieces of material can support not just each process specifically, as you can kind of see with the bullet points there on the screen, but we do have there is a lot of equipment that is used to be able to transition from step to step. A good example here that we can use is the way that the fill step is done. So when you fill a container, as I mentioned before, because we have this handy dandy dip tube integrated within each container, the filling you would want to do at an angle in order to avoid foaming. Equipment that allows you to be able to do that, to just automatically set the container at that ideal angle, is going to be a plus, as well as be able to lend itself well to being able to transport that same container from that process and be able to transfer it to a different process. Namely, there are carts that are designed to be able to not just fulfill the fill function, but also provide transportation to the next step. Another added bonus or another notable thing here within this process that adds value in terms of integration is mixing. So oftentimes when you freeze and then thaw and then you bring the bulk drug substance out, you might see a little bit of stratification, some separation as a result of that. What you may be interested in is having some sort of intermediary step before your final dispense to make sure that that fluid is homogenized. Again, that's not really a something that supports fill or dispense or freeze and thaw. That's really adding value to ensure that the transition throughout this process is done in a way that's optimal. So, as I mentioned before already, that focal point of the platform is the container itself. So, just to review the platform integration, what we're looking for is a container that can be adapted or that is customized already with the design of a freeze-thaw infrastructure or capital equipment that can perform both the freeze function and the thaw function with customizable configuration to make sure that when it's in a palletized load, that you have that air cooling happening in a way that it's aligned with the spaces already. What you'll also want to look out for is shipping and handling. So that's sort of the bridge between the two ends of this process, because you have your drug substance site and your drug product site in different places. You need to have a way to be able to transport the bulk drug substance in that palletized load, up to 300 liters within a container. Also ensuring that you can also keep that the bulk drug substance cool. So there is a passive cooling mechanism through the use of dry ice that can keep the substance cool. And the container itself is you can actually adapt it with some temp tails to make sure that you're keeping it at a proper temperature. And last but certainly not least is the material handling itself. So I made a lot of emphasis on these counter bores and making sure that when you handle the containers, that you don't do so in a way that might damage or compromise the integrity of the containers themselves. Material handling equipment that has already been designed to integrate with not just with the container shape and a number of containers within a pallet, but also the pallets themselves and the other equipment involved. What you'll notice in that, it's a bit harder to see, but in that freeze-thaw image at the top right, you're going to see some guardrails, that's little rails on the ground that come in front of the freezer. That is designed to integrate with the material handling equipment or the pallet loader that we see at the bottom there. So platforms should be designed around the BDS containers in order to provide that full end-to-end support. So just to kind of give you a brief idea of the qualification that's been done, we made a lot of comment about having pre-qualified equipment. Won't go into this in detail. If you want to go into this in more detail, we can speak later at the booth. But here's some of the qualification that's been done already on this platform, to kind of give you a sense of what's already been accomplished, regarding the platform characterization, the rigid container, and even just the single-use assembly itself. So won't go into that into detail, but just so that you guys have an understanding of what we're looking at here. So summarize, now that we're kind of coming down to the close, we're going to summarize a little bit about the learning objectives, see how we're able to address each of those learning objectives that we introduced at the very beginning. So the first one was reviewing improvements in the design of the single-use container itself. Now, what is it that we actually did in order to provide that review? It's a rigid and robust container, right? It's made out of HDPE. It can hold a consistent shape. It can take impact testing, drop testing, pressure testing. This thing can really take a beating. Operational flexibility lends itself well because we have TopWorks, custom configuration that can be configured to a lot of different types of filling or dispense operational paradigms. And of course, it's the single-use part of it. So this is something notable in contrast to single-use bags that may have container integrity issues at freezing temperatures. The next thing that we were able to achieve is understanding that last point of freezing. What does that even mean? Well, we were able to provide you with a sense that that convection air blast cooling is the method by which these containers are frozen. When that is done at a controlled rate, and through that controlled rate, what you're able to do, in addition to with the help of some additive insulation in avoidance of the ice bridging, as well as a design of consistent design features between the two different size containers, so that you have a consistent freeze path length, and that lends itself very well to being able to have scalability within the freeze thaw performance, no matter what batch size that you're using or which container that you're using. And then lastly, we were able to tie everything up together and provide you with an understanding of the value of that end-to-end platform solution. How did we do that? Well, we made emphasis on pre-qualified equipment that's already been tested, already been designed to work with each other, as opposed to being able to procure equipment individually a la carte, and then you have to figure out how to make it work. And that process integration, what that has already done is that's reduced the complexity that you have to deal with. That's already reduced the risk that you have when handling the bulk drug substance, as well as the freeze and thaw operations, fill and dispense operations as well. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation so far. So we have a lot more information that we can provide you at the booth. So if you can, please hold any questions and join us at the Meisner booth. I think it's around that time. It's looking like it's around that coffee hour again. That afternoon sort of pick me up, that buzz that you need. We have a coffee station at the Meisner booth. So if you'd like to talk more about CryoVault, talk more about this single-use platform solution, please visit us over at the booth. We have a lot more expertise over there, a lot more engineers that can explain to you a lot about the technical details and hopefully paint a better picture around the value that I was proposing here today. And with that, I want to thank all of you very much for your attention today. Thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of your afternoon here at INTERPHEX. Appreciate it.